Thank you very much, Alan. Thanks to all of you for the invitation to be here this evening. Thanks to your daughter for inviting you to take a walk down Broadway so the invitation would come. And Mazal Tov to Susan Fiedler on this extraordinary accomplishment, which I've been watching from afar, but with some great interest for quite some time. And to all of you, especially to the high schoolers who took big risks in coming to a school that was just getting off the ground, to their parents who took extraordinary risks in allowing their children to be in a place that was really unnavigated territory. It's really an extraordinarily courageous thing to start a school. It's an extraordinarily courageous thing to let your kid be part of a school that's being started. So this is a community, I think, characterized tonight by great leadership, great passion, but also great courage. And as someone who, as Alan said, did a little school starting in the past and is full-heartedly doing it again, it is really an extraordinary honor to be here tonight and to witness a community that's already in such a short time achieved such great success. I feel really, truly very blessed to be part of this extraordinary evening. I'd like to share with you a few thoughts this evening on why this evening matters, about why a school like the Jewish High School of Connecticut is more than just a Jewish high school in Connecticut, and why a school like the Jewish High School of Connecticut is actually a response to critical issues that I fear we don't think about nearly enough, to some of the perplexing and perhaps even dangerous things that are taking place across North American Jewry. And I'm going to tell you right up front what I'm going to say. It's not going to take that long to say it, but nonetheless, the evening has been not a short one. There was a good bit of wine outside before. So on the off chance that you're about to doze off and you're afraid that when you get jostled going out the door and somebody says to you, "Did you agree with what he said?" And you're like, "Oh my God, what did he say?" So I'm going to tell you right now what it is that he was going to say. You may miss some of the details if you then fall asleep, but at least you'll have a fundamental idea of what the thesis is, and you can begin to wax eloquent on why you did or did not agree. Here is what he is going to say. What he is going to say is this, that among the many different things happening to North American Jewry today, I would like to suggest, and I promised Michael that I would be a little bit controversial, so here goes, salvo number one. I want to suggest to you that American Jewry is undergoing a process that I would call Protestantization. And that American Jews, whether they recognize it or not, are becoming infinitely more Protestant than we used to be. That does not mean that we're not Jewish, and it doesn't mean that we don't take all sorts of things Jewishly seriously. It does mean this. The Protestant tradition, the Protestant community is a faith community. I remember actually when I was doing my doctorate at USC, there were a bunch of nuns. I wasn't planning on saying this, but there were a bunch of nuns. That's what you get when you fly overnight to Israel. Who was complaining about the red eye? You were complaining about the red eye. No sympathy, okay? It's a tiny little country here compared to the Atlantic Ocean. But in any event, I was, this goes back some 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. I was doing my PhD at USC. There were a couple of nuns in this program. And one of them tried to cozy up to the guy with the kippah and try to establish some sort of conversation. And she said to me, "Tell me about your faith community." And I said, "I don't have a faith community. I belong to a shul." And I thought that was hysterically funny. 3 of you did. That's, by the way, for the numbers next time, guys, 3, the number of people that laughed at my first joke. And she did not. She thought it was actually unbelievably sacrilegious. How could you not call your synagogue a faith community? What I wanted to say is if you hung around, you wouldn't call it a faith community either. But in all seriousness, synagogues are in part faith communities, but they're not really faith communities. They are people that bind together even though they don't all believe the same thing. They're not all really sure what they in fact believe, and I mean that perfectly seriously. They read the same exact words in the Siddur, and different emotions take them to very different places. But we do it because we're part of some larger whole. That's what it means to be a people. What it means to be a people as opposed to a faith community, what it means to be a people as opposed to simply a religion, means that if you are an Orthodox kid in the 1960s at Yeshiva University, and there are completely secular Jews behind the Iron Curtain who want to get out, even though you and they don't eat the same things, and even though you and they don't do the same things on Shabbat, and even though you and they don't believe anything like the same things, they are your problem and they are your responsibility. That's what it means to be a people. What it means to be a people was what we had in this country half a generation ago and certainly a full generation ago, where you might agree with Israeli politics, you might not agree with the politics of the current Israeli government, but you understood deep down that wherever the Jewish state goes, so too you go. And therefore, there were certain things that you would always say, and there were certain things that you would never say, especially in the op-ed page of the New York Times, because you understood that our fates were bound together. What it meant to be a people was, really with all due respect to that nun in my class so many years ago, that we were a faith community, but we were much more. We were so much more, in fact, that it didn't matter that we weren't really a faith community. What I mean by Jews becoming Protestants is not that Jews are worshiping a different God or that Jews are not being Jewish. What I mean is that we are adopting a Protestant conception of what Jewishness is. It is, in fact, the idea that we are a faith community. We have a certain relationship with the divine. We each work to create a certain personal relationship with that which we call transcendent, and we do it in different clusters. We call them different denominations. But fundamentally, what it means to be a Jew is to build this relationship. And more, the horizontal relationship, the relationship of connection one to the other, is beginning to disappear and to dissipate. And you can see it all across the map. If you look to one side of the map of the American Jewish community, and I'm going to try very hard tonight not to label it because I think the labels only do us damage. But there is a part of this relationship where you can see all sorts of things that indicate the ways in which peoplehood is beginning to become very marginal, if not completely faded away. You can see it, first of all, in the sense that, for example, rituals that have been just simply non-negotiable in Jewish life for thousands of years, regardless of what we believed, are now all of a sudden being discussed as optional. If you look very carefully at the websites, for example, that were at the forefront of the move in the Bay Area not that long ago to make circumcision not optional in the Jewish community, but illegal in the Bay Area, Jews were at the helm of this. Jews were at the helm of the idea that if you live in the Bay Area, you could not have a bris for your son. Now, if you read these websites carefully, it's clear that all the psychiatrists in this room could be kept very ably busy for a very long time trying to help a number of the people who were behind this. But that's not the point. The point is, I can see that all of the spouses are saying to each other, honey, go, we need the money. But in any event, the truth of the matter is that for the first time in Jewish history that we can really remember, in the freest country that Jews have ever lived in outside the Jewish state for Jews, you actually have serious conversation in certain parts of the Jewish community as whether or not Jews ought to be at the forefront of obliterating the very, very ritual that has been at the very claim of it's completely non-rational. It's completely not cerebral. It is simply a statement of this is what my people has done since Abraham, and this is how we simply mark ourselves as being part of something much larger than ourselves. The bris, by the way, which we start out by reading about Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen, Pinchas the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron the high priest, and it has the whole thing to do with how he actually assuaged God's passion by, tell him I'm not home, but he assuaged God's passion by slaying the people who were actually rebelling against the tribe. The bris is actually a kind of a draft notice. No parent really wants to hand over their boy to a moel at the age of 8 days. Every parent who's done it knows that there's a tremendous amount of angst at that moment. You do it not because at a certain point you want to, not because you think it's the right thing to do. You do it whether you can articulate it to yourself or not, because you understand that the baby's not yours. The baby belongs to something much bigger, much more important, ultimately much more powerful. The baby belongs to the Jewish people. And that's what the statement of the bris is really all about. And that's why it's no accident that as the Protestantization of American Judaism continues apace, one of the first things that's under attack has been the ceremony of the Brit Milah. Give you another example. There's a lot of examples that could be given, but American Jews have raised to a new art form the art of not learning a second language. Now, Americans in general have made this an art form. Europeans don't understand how it is that we actually think English is a sufficient way of walking across the planet. So we don't speak French that well, we don't speak Spanish that well, we don't speak a lot of things that well. But my parents, who thank God are both still alive and living near us in Yerushalayim, grew up, both of them, in Hebrew-speaking homes in New York. There are very few non-Israeli Hebrew-speaking homes in America anymore. American Jews fundamentally made a decision not to learn Hebrew, and this school, thankfully, is a profound exception to that general rule. There's also lots of other exceptions out there, and if you read the cover story of the Jewish Week this week about charter schools, you see that Hebrew is a major component there too. I'm not suggesting this is the only school in the world doing it, but you certainly know that in adopting Hebrew, and I forget the number of hours that have been spent in Hebrew, thank you very much, that's exactly what I wanted to know. I think that's an approximation, actually, but in any event. But nonetheless, the fact that you take Hebrew so seriously is a statement, a profound statement about peoplehood. Because peoples have languages and religions don't. What language do you need to speak to be a Protestant? It depends if you're a Protestant living in Taiwan, and there are Protestants living in Taiwan, or if you're a Protestant living in Iowa. Your language has nothing to do with your Protestantism. The same thing, by the way, is true of Islam. Most American Muslims don't speak a word of Arabic. They simply don't need it. You'll say, yes, but the prayers are in Arabic. So what? The Mass was in Latin. How many American Catholics spoke Latin? You can say certain words, you can sound certain sounds in order to be part of a larger communal thing, but you don't actually need to speak a language to be part of a religion. You need to speak a language to be part of a people. And the American Jewish abandonment of Hebrew, to which, as I said, this school is an extraordinary exception, is part of that larger movement away from being a people to actually just simply being a faith community. And I point out to you, by the way, that the reason peoples have languages is because languages are not simply instrumental. Languages are not the tools with which we walk into a store and order whatever you want to get. You buy a dress, you buy a tie, you order a burger, you order your coffee. You don't even need to know English to order coffee because it's all made up words, right? Tall means the smallest one, et cetera, et cetera. Right? I love America. It's a great place. But in any event, and languages say a tremendous amount. There are entire worlds of communication that are embedded in language. I'll give you an example. In English, we say, I fell in love with her. Which means, I took one look across a crowded room, a reference which the parents get and the children don't. Right? But I took one look across a crowded room, and I was entirely out of control, and I couldn't sleep. I waited by the phone as if waiting by the phone was going to make it ring, etc., etc. In Hebrew, we don't say I fell in love with her. We say hit ahavti ba. Now, if you know even a little bit of Hebrew grammar, you know that hit ahev is a reflexive verb. It's that seventh binyan, which you don't really remember because it's always at the end of the school year. But it really does exist. And it's really not the Hitpael's form that it's number 7. I mean, it's only number 7 because some textbook called it number 7. Hitpael thinks it's number 1. But in any event, it's a reflexive verb, so to say, hit ahavti ba means, literally, I came to love myself through her. It's an entirely different conception of love. Peoples have languages not simply because they want different vocabularies, but because they bespeak entire worldviews in ways that they can only do with that language. It's no accident that Hebrew has no word for accountability. I mean, we have never needed it. Hebrew has no word for subtlety. Why make up a word you're never going to use? But English has no word for davka, because Protestants don't get that nasty. I actually, when I was at JTS, that's true. It's true. You know it. When I was at JTS, we'd sit in these graduate classes, and somebody would say something that you disagreed with, and somebody would say, nicely, that's absurd. Then I went to USC, which, as I mentioned already, was this very Protestant environment, and I found out how you say, that's absurd in Protestant. You say, I wonder if you've considered the following possibility. Now, if you speak Protestant, you know that that's equally nasty. But for a Jew coming from JTS, that felt so unbelievably loving, even though what they were telling you was that it was entirely wrong. Languages are entire worldviews. You cannot have Dostoevsky in a language other than Russian. And even if those of us in this room don't speak Russian and read or read Dostoevsky in English, we know that Bialik was right. that to read a great text in a language other than the original is, Bialik said, like kissing the bride through the veil. Is it a kiss? Yes. And is it the stuff of which dreams are made? Absolutely not. So you have the circumcision conflict, you have the whole issue of language, you have all sorts of issues that indicate that American Jews are gradually refashioning themselves as a religion, as a faith community, and not as a people. And I'd suggest to you that one of the ways in which you see that most clearly today in American Jewish life is in the conflict among American Jews about Israel. Because religions do not have countries. Where's the Protestant country? Where's the Buddhist country? Where's the Sikh country? I know about the Vatican, thank you very much. But the point is that most religions do not have countries, and in fact, the Palestinians make a point of suggesting that the Jews never were a people and are quote-unquote only a religion because they understand that in international parlance, religions don't get countries, peoples get countries. And I would suggest to you that a tremendous part of what we face from this part of the community, that part of the community that wants to eradicate the Brit Milah, that part of the community that doesn't take Hebrew seriously, that part of the community that wants to be as universalist as it can possibly be, that does not want to be separate, that does not want to be distinct, we can actually see its problematics and its problematic relationship with Israel emerge really from the fact that if Israel is to be specifically important to the Jews have to be a people, but they don't want to be a people. Since they don't want to be a distinct people, then Israel simply has to be treated like any other country. Why should I feel more towards a Jew in Israel than I feel towards an impoverished or attacked or maimed or bruised Rwandan, for example, who clearly lives in a country that's suffering much more than either the Israelis or the Palestinians or all of them put together for that matter? In other words, once I become a universalist, once I look at the world only through a moral lens and not through a lens of belonging to something critical myself, then why does Israel matter? The only thing that Israel can do actually is to muck up the works of my trying to be a fully realized universalist human being. And that's where the tremendous angst that this part of our community in the United States feels about Israel really comes from. Now you could be saying to yourself, well, yes, but there's the other side of the community. There's the other side of the community that has certainly not abandoned the Brit Milah, that has not abandoned Hebrew, that has not abandoned particularism, that is profoundly and passionately, unabashedly committed to Israel. Why isn't that the model to which we should aspire? And why does a school like this, therefore, have to come somewhere in the middle? I'll tell you why that's not the model to which we can aspire. And you saw it on the video. When you see these young people talking about how what they are encouraged to do is to find their own answers and to make their own decisions about what they're going to take with themselves, all of us as parents who've had kids go through this know it sounds a lot better in theory before they do it than when they actually do it. Right? In other words, you say to your child, what I want you to do is to make your own decisions and to make responsible decisions and to learn and to conclude out of knowledge. Then you say, you're deciding what? You know, you traitor to everything I've ever taught you. You are your mother's child through and through. But the truth of the matter is that after we get over the initial disappointment that our children are not exactly like the choices that we made, we understand that that's what it means for them to become fully fleshed adults. And I would suggest to you that in the part of our community in which Brit Milah is not negotiable, in which Hebrew still reigns supreme, in which devotion to Israel is unparalleled, all things that are very good. The one thing that we cannot say with equal passion is that that is a community that encourages young people to make their own decisions. The one thing that you cannot say is that it's a community that teaches young people to respect, to love, to embrace Jews who live lives very different from themselves. And we don't have to get all that particular for the point to be absolutely clear. I would suggest to you that this is a community struggling with a question of how do we raise a new generation? What kind of a Jew should be the Jew of the 21st century? And it's really not that surprising when you think about it, that we don't know the answer to that. The Jewish people has now lived through two of the most traumatic events that it has ever had to experience in the space of the last 70, 80 years. One, obviously, was the Shoah in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, and the other was the creation of the State of Israel just a few years later. And we can have a long conversation, both theological and historical, about to what degree they were connected and derivative one from the other. It's not terribly important. And if you're saying to yourself, why would you call Israel traumatic? It is traumatic. It is traumatic to go from being 2,000 years of criticizing those who are in power to all of a sudden having power. It is traumatic to go from being a people that complains for 2,000 years what it means to be a powerless minority in the midst of others, to all of a sudden have minorities in your midst with whom you're not exactly sure what kind of relationships to build. They're both traumatic. So we are living in a world of unprecedented change in the Jewish people, and I would suggest to you that there are, by and large, two predominant responses. One response says that this complexity is so enormously overwhelming. This complexity of how to be a citizen of the world, but also a citizen of my own people, is so overwhelming that what I'm going to do is I want to just simply be a citizen of the world. And because I want to be a citizen of the world, I don't want my son to look any different than any other son. And because I want to be a citizen of the world, my children don't need to speak a language that virtually nobody speaks. Even though, by the way, the rebirth of Hebrew was really one of the great miracles of contemporary Jewish life. It's not an exaggeration to say, it's really not an exaggeration to say, that 150 years ago you could have taken every single Jew on the planet who spoke Hebrew, every single person on the planet who spoke Hebrew, and put them comfortably in this building. And now, obviously, things have changed rather dramatically. I would not say that the Intifada was a very funny period of Israeli history. I think that about that there's pretty universal agreement. But there was one moment of the Intifada that I actually still think about, which was actually very funny. There was a bombing at the southern Tel Aviv bus station. That was not funny. People were hurt. I don't think anybody was killed, but people were hurt. And that was also not funny. Then, of course, the news cameras immediately raced to the scene of the thing, and they interview some recent American Ola who had just gotten off the plane. And they stick a camera and a microphone in front of her, and she said, "Ani me'od pachadati, shamati ra'ash gadol velo yadati le'on larutz." Okay, and then there's this guy who's tall, about 6'80", built like this, a black guy, clearly not of Jewish origins. He was from the Congo, if I'm not mistaken, and he was working in Israel for a number of years, and they thrust the microphone into his face. And he said, "Tishma, hamatzav מאוד מסובך, אבל צריך לדעת איך להתמודד." And then I thought to myself, okay, I wonder what Eliezer ben Yehuda is actually thinking at this moment. Is he smiling ear to ear, or if you can cringe in your grave, is he cringing? I don't know, but the truth of the matter is that the rebirth of Hebrew was actually one of the great miracles of the Jewish people. But as I said before, you don't need a language for a religion. So therefore, if I want to become a universal citizen, I want to move away from that ritual that clearly sets me apart, that both Jews and their enemies for thousands of years have understood sets me apart. I don't want to teach my kids a language that sets them apart. I don't really want to teach them a tradition that has notions of peoplehood which then lead to chosenness, which leads to all sorts of complications that I don't want them to have to embrace. And finally, the last thing I need is a country for this people. And then, as I said before, there is on the other side a group that says, I absolutely want to look different. And I absolutely want to speak that language. And I absolutely want to be particular. And I desperately believe that virtually everything that country does is absolutely right. But here's the problem with that second side. And it actually goes back to that evening at Columbia, which for me was a memorable evening in a lot of ways. Because I went to Columbia a long time ago. And when I went to Columbia, if we got on a Friday night with all of the various minyanim put together, and I'm including the Jews and the Christians who were dating the Jews, and all of those various people, if we had 150 people on a Friday night in a little place called Earl Hall, we thought that was just an unbelievable accomplishment. Then you come back 30-something years later, and all of a sudden you go into Friday night, and there's like 500, 600, 700 kids there, which on one level feels absolutely great. But the more you hang around, and the more you talk to these kids, And the more you spend time talking to them over email and Facebook and God only knows where in the weeks and months after that event, the more you find out that the Jewish community there, especially that traditional Jewish community, has become so enormous at places like Columbia and Penn and University of Maryland and other places that they can, and in many cases, not all, but in many cases actually do, live their entire lives, with the exceptions of those other people who somehow made it into their classroom, exclusively in the confines of that community. Meeting nobody who's not like them, forming friendships with nobody who's not like them. Most importantly, hearing profound ideas from nobody who's not exactly like them. And I would suggest to you that neither of those models is going to sustain American Jewish life into the 21st century. The model that says we want to be just citizens of the world and nothing particular about us clearly cannot survive. The language of the Jewish people about itself from time immemorial has been the language of peoplehood. So if I want to surrender that and get rid of the Brit Milah and get rid of Hebrew and get rid of the country and get rid of all of the things that make us different, I'm basically selling Judaism completely down the river, whether I want to use that language or not. But if I am also so confident that it is my particular slice of the pie that has a monopoly on theological truth, on sociological predictability, on how to raise Jewish children who are more likely than not to intermarry, more likely than not to follow my traditions, and so on and so forth, to the point that they don't talk to any other Jews, I would suggest to you that is an equally serious assault on Jewish peoplehood, even though it looks and sounds very different. If the only way to raise my Jewish children is to make sure that they're not infected by the ideas of other Jewish children, that is an assault on Jewish peoplehood. If the only way to raise my children is to send them to a college, even if it's an Ivy League college with thousands of intelligent non-Jewish people, they exist. I know you find that hard to believe, but they're really out there. And they're very smart, and they have some interesting ideas. But if my basic hope is that my kid will go to class, get A's, get a doctorate, get a postdoc, get a second postdoc, and then we'll see, and through all of that time not establish a serious, meaningful relationship with anybody, Jewish especially, who's not exactly or more or less like us, I would propose to you that that is also an assault on Jewish peoplehood. Because when Yud Lamed Peretz, the great Yiddish writer in Warsaw, died, his funeral was attended by 100,000 Jews in Warsaw, Hasidim and Mitnagdim, and religious and secular, and people from Warsaw and people from far away, and rich and poor, and certainly men and women. It was an entire cross-section of the Jewish world. And I ask you today, who is there in the Jewish world, in the United States or in Israel or anywhere else, who could die for whom Jews of all sectors of life would come out to honor that woman or that man? And I suggest to you that the instances are almost impossible to think of. And we don't have to go about debating now which ones. There's a few certain obvious cases, but I would suggest to you that there are many Jewish groups that would not come out, even for whoever it is that you're thinking of. And therefore, what I propose to you tonight is that we are actually, as an American Jewish community, and an Israeli Jewish community, by the way, in different ways, but it's a different story, we are an American Jewish community in deep crisis when it comes to the idea of peoplehood. We have either abandoned it completely, or we are so intent on maintaining it that we won't allow our children to be infected by anybody who's not just like them, which I think is actually its own assault on peoplehood. And what you're doing in building this extraordinary school, what you're doing in building this really unparalleled Jewish community, what you're doing with your courage, with your vision, with your ambition, and with your creativity, is you are taking stock of what's out there and are finding the courage to buck both trends. And you're saying you have enough trust in your teachers, and you have enough trust in your children, and you have enough trust in the majesty of the Jewish tradition, and you have enough trust in intellectual human acuity to say to your children that if you really think, and you're really taught how to think critically, and you're surrounded by teachers and principals and administrators and board members and lay leaders who are decent, who are thoughtful, who are caring, we don't need to program you. We don't need to blind you to the peoplehood that has always been part of our tradition. But either do we need to protect that peoplehood by blinding you to other voices in the Jewish community that can enrich you and that can ultimately make you a much better person, a much better Jew, and quite possibly a much better Jewish leader. So I will speak personally by way of conclusion. It's a long way from Israel, from my house to this shul. As some of you are probably aware, the non-stop Jerusalem-Bridgeport flights don't go that often. But it's worth it. It's worth it actually to be up most of the night because, God, the guy next to me snored loud. He was above the Bose tolerance level, so that's pretty serious. But it's worth it because in an era in which it is really possible to despair about the future of the Jewish people, in an era in which it's possible to despair because there are Jews who are willing to sell the whole story down the river, and there are Jews who want to defend it so vigorously that they don't care about the rest of the picture. It's worth it to walk into a room filled with parents, filled with young adults, filled with teachers and administrators and rabbis and lay people and founders and funders alike who believe in something bigger and grander and better for the Jewish people. As a citizen of the Jewish people, happens to be a state across the ocean, but it really doesn't matter. And as a citizen of the Jewish people who cares deeply for what the 21st century is going to bring, and who sometimes worries deeply about what is around the bend, to be in this room tonight is actually a great gift. It's a great gift to witness the regeneration of profound Jewish leadership. It's a great gift to witness the regeneration of extraordinary young people. It's a great gift to see the extraordinary courage, vitality, passion, creativity, and vigor that Jewish communities that may not be making huge headlines across the world are actually finding within themselves in order to transform the future of the Jews. What you have done is a gift not only to your children, what you have done is a gift not only to this community, not only even to the state of Connecticut. What you have done, I would suggest, is to create something that is a gift to the entire Jewish people. And I believe that because you're going to be successful, the world is going to look back one day, and our Jewish people is going to look back one day on efforts like yours and, God willing, many others, and say, those were the people who dared to dream big. Those were the people who saved the Jewish people. Hatzlacha rabba b'hemshech haderech. I wish you continued success in your community.